For little under 14 years, the Taiping Rebellion waged over China. 17 provinces were ravished, and the estimated loss of life is between 20 and 25 million. It is the deadliest civil war, one of the deadliest wars ever, and the largest conflict of the 19th century. The Qing Dynasty, however, was not only faced with the Taiping Rebellion during this time, but with several other rebellions throughout the country and the Second Opium War. It is one of the bloodiest episodes in Chinese history, which really says something. And this raises an interesting question. How did the Qing manage to stay in power during this carnage? The First Opium War between China and the United Kingdom waged from 1839 to 1842. The result was the humiliating Treaty of Nanking, which did not mention opium, the primary cause of the war, at all. The Second Opium War, or the Arrow War, broke out after the United Kingdom and France had won the Crimean War in the European theater against Russia. This meant they could concentrate their troops in the Far East and once again wage war against China. In 1860, the French and British forces reached and overtook Beijing, China's capital, upon which the Xianfeng Emperor fled to Yaol. All this will be delved into in a video about these wars, but it is important to note this took place during the Taiping Rebellion. This already gives an idea of the chaotic situation within China. Well, in 1851, in southern China, the Guangxi province, to be exact, a rebellion under Heng Xiuquan broke out. It would become known as the Taiping Rebellion. Many reasons and causes can be given for the outbreak of this rebellion, with one of the major ones being the horrible conditions the peasantry was living in. The quality of life in rural China during this age, and basically up until far into the next century, was abhorrent. And why did it break out in the south? Well, it was a lost territory consolidated under the Qing Dynasty and was located furthest away from the capital. The area was notorious for its secretive sects with anti-dynastic convictions. Furthermore, China's defeat during the First Opium War had severely tainted the prestige of the dynasty, especially in the south, as the majority of the war had taken place there. One of the concessions after the war was that China had to open ports other than Canton, in turn leading to large unemployment around this area, as harbors such as Shanghai were closer to the silk and tea producing areas. Now, one last reason was pirates. After 1842, Chinese pirates were driven inland by the British Navy after a campaign of pirate suppression. All these elements were a poisonous cocktail that was very likely to end up in a rebellion. But a rebellion of this magnitude? Nobody had foreseen that. And let's figure out what the roots of this Taiping movement were. China had a history with rebellions driven by an ideological force, such as Buddhism, for example, the White Lotus Rebellion, or secret societies that adhered to a folk Taoist ideology. The Taiping Rebellion was unique as it had a Christian impulse. There had been European Protestant missionaries active on the southern Chinese coast for several decades, and, among others, their preaching reached a village school teacher in Guangxi by the name of Heng Xiuquan, a member of the minority Hakka people. Heng had failed the Chinese state exams 4 times. Heavily influenced by a poorly understood Christian tractatus, it is said he became delusional. During one of these episodes, he had visions that convinced him he was the new Messiah. In conclusion, he logically realized he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. These tracts that influenced Heng were written by Liang Fa, and Heng decided to base his religion on the Old rather than the New Testament. This in turn created a more militant ideology, which adhered to the 10 Commandments, but not the Sermon on the Mount. In short, he created his own justification. Alright, so Heng Xiuquan had a charismatic personality, and he convinced several people to follow him, as he was still convinced he was Jesus' younger brother. A distant cousin of his, Feng Yuxian, created the God Worshipper Society based on Heng's idea of Christianity. This cult quickly grew as more disaffected people were recruited over the years. Peasants, pirates, triad members, and Hakkas, it didn't matter. Then in 1850, armed resistance against government troops broke out. Small skirmishes occurred until eventually in 1851, the Yinqiang armed revolt was the first major success of the Taiping. Taiping forces routed forces loyal to the Qing Dynasty. It marked the official beginning of the Taiping Rebellion, and as you do when you rout imperial forces, Hung declared himself Heavenly King of the Heavenly Kingdom of Eternal Peace, Taiping Tiankuo. What would follow was the deadliest civil war ever. So much for eternal peace. As Hung declared his heavenly kingdom, the cult saw it as its goal to establish its own empire with Hung at its head. The rebellion quickly expanded and gained momentum, killing and recruiting thousands on its path. The bands of peasants and rebels quickly transformed into over 1 million disciplined, extremely zealous warriors, with strict moral restrictions upon which we will touch later. The organization of the army was elaborate and strict. Indoctrination occurred to such a degree that many times Taiping troops chose death, even suicide, over capture. Several Chinese southern provinces were taken over in record tempo, and eventually even Nanking, the second city of China, only behind Beijing, was captured in 1853. Nanking's name was changed to Tianjin, or Heavenly Capital. Now ruling southern China, Hung felt rather confident and sent a northern expedition towards the Qing capital, Beijing. While this expedition failed, it did manage to penetrate Tianjin, another important city, before it was forced to retreat. The Taiping Empire consolidated itself amidst the Yangtze River, and several more attempts to capture the rich agricultural grounds of Yunnan failed. The philosophy of the Taiping rebels was a mixture of old Confucian and new Christian elements. Puritanism was very present, as prostitution, opium, and gambling were prohibited on their territory. Its followers were inspired by its dogmatic and Puritan worldview. The Taipings offered an ideological and societal alternative to being a peasant. Wan Xiucheng considered a proper way of carrying out his divine task of repenting demons by destroying traditional Buddhist, Taoist temples and Confucianist ancestor tablets. This magnitude and severity of iconoclasm is never seen before in China. Aside from the slaughter, thousands, if not tens of thousands, of ancient Chinese temples and other relics were destroyed. The Taiping was revolutionary in another sense as well: women's emancipation. The century-old practice of foot binding was outlawed, and women could even serve in the army as officers. And there were plenty of women that did serve. Considering the Taiping had forces that numbered in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands, if even a fraction was female, it was already more than armies generally employed during this time. Private property was abolished, and land was distributed between families that were clustered as religious, military, and political units. All of this was only put into practice at a small scale, as the Taiping grip over their conquered territories wasn't too tight due to their lack of caterers. Especially the gentry, which would have supplied the Taiping with educated leaders, was scared by the revolutionary doctrines and practices. One could argue that this is where one of the main reasons lie for the eventual demise of the Taiping. Now, as a historical footnote, a little under 100 years later, Mao's communists consolidated their power over China. The Taiping served as an example of a precursor of the eventual communist revolution because of their primitive style communism and resistance towards the gentry and any old religious and ideological sentiments. The jealousy of several military commanders of the Taiping proved fatal. Yang Shuqing, the Machiavellian commander-in-chief of the Taiping, pretended he went into trances during which he spoke with the Holy Trinity. While Hung claimed to be the Son of God, he did not fake these kind of experiences. Yang being the most influential commander of the Taiping, he was a real threat to Hung. In 1856, Yang challenged Hung's leadership, demanding a title only reserved for the emperor. Hung tasked his king of the north, Wei Chongwei, to assassinate Yang. Wei did so, together with the general Qing Dynasty, but in the process he massacred Yang's family too and thousands of his followers. Well, Hung felt it was only right to assassinate Wei after this complete onslaught. Another general, Shida Kai, grew worrisome and decided to take his followers, leave Nanjing, and cut ties with Hung. The rest of the Taiping generals were quick to fall as intrigues and conspiracies managed to really thin out the military command of the movement. It left Hung with subpar relatives and loyalists to lead the army and govern the provinces of the kingdom. The kingdom would last for another 8 years, mainly thanks to the military genius Li Sucheng governing the Taiping troops at the lower Yangtze. Now, the Qing weren't just sitting idly by during this time. Zheng Guofan was tasked with reorganizing the imperial army. He organized the Hunan army, which became a powerhouse within the Qing military establishment, but loyal primarily to Zheng. This meant its military control became decentralized, and this Hunan army will play a role again during the period of warlordism, over 60 years later. For now, Tseng tasked his young disciple Li Hongchang to build up the Anhui army in order to support his Hunan army. Raising tribute and grain from territories around the Yangtze, he was properly financed, bought Western arms, and increased the army size to 70,000. It was the largest professional standing army serving the imperial government. The Taiping kingdom was crumbling, and its soldiers were pushed back more and more. The incentive to purchase Western arms was given by the victory against the Taiping of the so-called ever-victorious army under the American Frederick Townsend Ward. As the Taiping forces came closer to the outskirts of Shanghai in 1862, this small Western army defended the treaty port and repelled the Taiping. After Ward's death that same year, British Major Charles Chinese Gordon took over command. Chinese troops were recruited into the force, and the Sino-Foreign army captured Suzhou, while a similar Franco-Chinese force captured Hangzhou. Basically, the Taiping were locked in Nanjing at this point. Nanjing was surrounded by Chen Kuo-fen's younger brother by 1862, and the siege would last for over 2 years, but the city was eventually captured without any foreign assistance. As for the leaders of the once mighty Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, Hung committed suicide a month before the city fell. But, well, that's one version of the story. Another one is that food supplies ran low and he ate weeds. He ate weeds and fell ill, which resulted in his death. Okay. Sporadic Taiping uprisings would continue to occur throughout the region for the next 4 years. Interestingly enough, the commander Li Fuzhong, leading Shida Kai's army, was defeated in 1871. 7 years after Hung's death. You can see some branches lasted for a while, and it underlined the lack of control Qing forces had in some regions. Nevertheless, in essence, Hung's suicide meant the bloody and brutal end of the Taiping Rebellion. The armies under Tseng did the bulk of the fighting, and the Qing Dynasty was saved by its loyal bureaucratic machine and army commanders. What I find rather fascinating about the time period of the Taiping Rebellion is that as the Taiping Rebellion was waging over the Chinese mainland, in other areas massive rebellions broke out as well, completely separate from the Taiping. One of the most dangerous of those rebellions was the Nian Rebellion in northern China. It was inspired by the White Lotus sect, with the direct reason for the outbreak being the poor socio-economic situation of the peasants and the flooding of the Yellow River. These rebels defeated the Qing troops from their fortified villages, and the rebellion would wage on until 1868 and caused over 100,000 deaths and an economic collapse of the region. In several other areas, Muslim population of China revolted against the Han Chinese and Manchu-led Qing dynasty. The Panthay Rebellion, known in China as the Du and Shu Rebellion, broke out in 1856 and lasted for 17 years. Over 2 million people died during this bloody revolt. The Dungan Revolt broke out in 1862 under the leadership of Yaqub Beg, in which a Muslim minority in western China faced the troops of the Qing dynasty. It is estimated over 17 million people died during this war. Famine, disease, and atrocities from both sides being the main causes, just like the Taiping Rebellion. These mid-century rebellions were crushed without Western participation, although many Western arms were used. You're probably wondering how the Qing managed to stay in power with massive rebellions going on in virtually every province. Fairbank and Reischauer write that the monopolization of administrative talent played a central role. Those that knew how to govern the Chinese Empire were loyal to the tradition of scholar governments and, more importantly, preferred the Manchu Qing dynasty instead of a group of revolutionary rebels. Tseng and Li furthermore appointed their own supporters to important positions within the bureaucratic machine. The Qing would never regain control over all of China after the disastrous Taiping Rebellion. A period of self-strengthening followed in which the Qing attempted to regain control over the country. The Qing would manage to stay in power for several more decades, but these several decades saw an increase in Western encroachment, rebellions, and wars, with both Western powers and the new rising Asian power, Japan. If that sounds interesting, consider subscribing to my channel, as I'll be making a video series on that. Thank you for watching this video, and what is a person or event from Chinese history that you would like to know more about, and perhaps see a video of? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel. See you next time.